Welcome to this episode of Orthodontics in Interview. Now, it's my pleasure to bring you guys Linton Nash all the way from Australia. So, Linton, thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
So, I had the pleasure to meet Linton at this year's European Aligner Societies meeting in Brussels. Now, Linton gave an exceptional lecture where he was um, intellectual, he was provocative, he was direct, and gave a lecture that we were speaking about afterwards with the moderators. And actually, one of the moderators said, "Your lecture, Linton, was the one that made him go home and rethink his attachment." So I'm super excited to have you on. You're a dynamic speaker, and you've also questioned some of the principles within aligners and done your own research to try and figure out how stuff works. And for me, that is the Larry Andrews. That's the guy tinkering around in his shed to try and advance our profession. So I want to get into your tinkering. So a bit of background about Linton. So he's based over in Australia, in Victoria. He did his undergrad from Queensland. He did his orthodontic training at the National University of Singapore. He's a member of the Royal College of Edinburgh, member of the Australian Dental Association. He is also the president of the Australian Society of Lingual Orthodontics. He's done numerous additional studies, including 2018 Leadership in Victoria Health Sector. He's also serving in the Australian Army Reserves. He has contributions towards charitable works in terms of cleft, working at the Monash Medical Centre for Cleft Lip and Palate. He also is part of the Australian Vietnam Dental Health Project and Give a Smile program. And I think this is always important that we recognize that our eminent speakers actually have wider contributions to society, which sometimes doesn't get any light shone on it. But this is incredible, and this is what inspiration should look like in different domains. Your family practice. So you're a family of dentists and orthodontists. So Nash Senior, David Nash, is an orthodontist who you work with. Your mother, Lynette, is the practice manager. Your wife is an oral health therapist. So this is a family business in the truest sense. You also received the award from the Australian Dental Society as Outstanding Young Dentist in 2021. So, Linton, thank you for joining me.
No, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. Um, I'm just embarrassed by my own bio at this point.
Cool. Uh, but so, Linton, thank you again. Really, it's great to have you here. And it's also great to, as I mentioned, to be able to describe the achievements of some of our speakers and contributors to the orthodontic community. And it's an inspiration, really, it is. I think it's great that these things do get shared. Okay, Linton, so I'm going to get into the first bit, attachment. So when you spoke in Brussels at the EAS, you mentioned errors that take place with attachments, and you opened my mind to what actually happens. Thinking of something which is default and something that's in the background, actually you brought it to the surface. And you mentioned the acronym VALE, which is volume, abrasion, location, and errors. Could you talk through for the audience what that acronym means in terms of those definitions and what we do about them?
Yeah. So essentially, when it came to it, I looked at attachments and I thought I was sticking them on pretty well. I was just like, yep, these are things, you put them on, you're going to get what's in the plan. And sort of for a long time, that was just the default setting. And there was a bit of material science stuff. You know, some people had tried hard, some people had tried flowable, packable composites, flowable composites, but really everyone sort of found that it was much more operator dependent. And then along came something new that I caught wind of, and I thought, look, is this actually better? Like, and how do I actually know if this is better? And I thought someone must have come up with a list of all the problems that could go along with attachments, and they hadn't. So then I was like, okay, well, I better come up with this comprehensive list of everything that could go wrong. So volumetric errors, we kind of know this. This is things where the attachment's bigger than what you want or smaller than what you want. And there are a few sort of subsets. One of the extreme subsets is the overall shape. So what I found with at least some of my research, looking at about 30, 40 patients, is generally the ridges of the attachment, even if the volume was deficient, the ridges were quite accurate. But in a small subset, even the ridges weren't defined. So you actually lost the entire shape. It became an almost amorphous blob of an attachment. There's such a small sample, it's kind of hard to say, but in general, there's not statistically or scientifically significant, but those teeth didn't move very well. But there's only like 4 or 5 of them. So then you had your volume. Then you get on to your A. So abrasion, there is some really good research on this, basically showing that attachment volume decreases over time, which makes sense. The attachments you put on originally are going to get smaller over time. And there's a good paper where they showed that essentially you would lose about 13% of the volume over an 8-month period. And they looked at other things and other factors, and really the big factors were the attachment shape. So your kind of rounded attachments tended to lose a lot more volume, like from a lot earlier on, and there was bigger errors with those. And there was a sex dimorphism. So females tended to have more abrasion than males. So then I go, okay, well, what can we do about that? We need to think about our composite, our bonding. We need to basically, I started making my attachments bigger, assuming that I'm going to lose volume on them. Locational errors, and there's a great research paper, it's still in thesis form by Chen, and he looked at essentially the accuracy of location of the attachments, and they looked at as far as where it was with trimming the aligners. And then I've looked at it in terms of my kind of superimposition, as far as where that is. But it's an error that you have some means to control. But you can have the perfect shape, and if you put it in the wrong spot, suddenly forces can be flipped. And there's a few finite element model studies, and whether that makes a clinical difference, I'm not entirely sure. But there is some data and there's papers to say, you need that initial fit to be as accurate as possible for all other things to work through. We don't have that full sample yet. And then the other errors is where it gets really interesting. So that's things like separation errors, and that can be from a range of problems, from wrong composite. You're choosing a composite that can only cure to 2 mils thick. You've got a 2.5 mil thick attachment, plus an attachment template. The composite's not going to set, so you can have uncured resin. You can have a faulty curing light not setting. And I think that I had one of our curing lights in our practice had a slightly faulty battery. And by doing some of this research, I figured that we were getting these separation errors where it looked fine on the scan. And then, I look at it a month later and there's suddenly a gap under the attachment. I'm going, how did that happen? It tracked it down to a single curing light, which had like composite on the end, and it wasn't setting the attachment properly. So obviously that resin was being lost over time. Then there's other things like flash, and everyone can kind of see this, and you generally flick it off, and there's ways to manage that, but it has effects on the force. So there's a brilliant research paper by Zoe Larson, who looked at essentially the more flash on one side, the more the force went the opposite way. The force became more variable. There was basically some sites where you had increased force, some sites you had decreased force. Overall, the aligner wasn't engaging properly. And there are kind of a few other ones, but that's sort of the guts of it. I basically just thought, I need to figure out everything that could go wrong, put it in a table, because then I can start testing for those individual things.
Great. And that's in the Australasian Orthodontic Journal from last year. And I was reading that and thinking, wow, I haven't seen this. I do them, but I haven't seen it. What concerned me about your paper is you've also described actually some other errors. So just the premise of it was that you did a scan, you had your attachment template made, and then you fitted the attachments and took a scan, and then you superimposed to see what had actually happened. You also made mention that actually just in fitting the attachment template could cause some tooth movement. You also mentioned that plaque on the teeth does cause an error to take place, and these are pretty significant in terms of what they could potentially do. My question to you is in this list, and I appreciate you are now finding the answers, but in your opinion, which one of these is the biggest variable in terms of creating errors in our attachments?
I think the biggest unspoken one is plaque. And so to that end, I've sent you a video, and I'm sure we can kind of superimpose it somewhere around here. But that's me doing kind of backyard Australian research on myself, and I got my father involved, and I'm getting some other Dr. Nashes in America because I want to make it the Nash paper, so it's Nash, 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 and Nash. But basically what we did is I brushed my teeth in the morning, I didn't brush my teeth at night. And it took me about 4 or 5 days to do this because I kept brushing my damn teeth and ruining my own research paper. I came into the clinic the next morning. I scanned my teeth. I then went away. 10 minutes later, came back, brushed all my teeth, did the same scan again. There was, in that 24-hour period, up to interproximity, it was about 0.4 mil, and maybe that was a bit of breakfast or something, but there was about 0.4 mil in some areas worth of extra flash now, or extra kind of plaque stuff. Then on top of that, you had sort of on the buccal surface, especially the upper sixes, lower lingual, kind of the area where the salivary glands dump saliva. You had kind of about a 0.1, 0.2 mil. Now, this is like big movements. Like you kind of go, yes, I could kind of detect in my data, there was a kind of this 0.1, 0.2 overall, the entire arch form variation. And there is some data on resting blood pressure that can change, whether the person's just eaten. And I think part of that inaccuracy in that is I've just put an attachment on. I've pushed the attachment template into the tooth. And I think that's actually creating most of that error because I'm pushing it in. But it's not just for this. Like this is me talking about attachments, and that's because I know that with the attachments, you put it on, you're going to clean the teeth first. Now I'm going to put flowable in there. If I've got 0.1 to 0.2 mil of lack of gap on that tooth, that flowable I'm putting in for the attachment is going to spread in that space. On top of that, every subsequent aligner is going to have that gap. So maybe it's a good thing that the flowable spreads in that space. I like, not from an aesthetic point of view, we're flicking it all off. It stains, it goes yucky, but maybe we're actually filling in the plaque. So I changed our protocol. Like we now brush the patient's teeth or have the patient brush their teeth prior to doing a record scan. And I've got photos, and I'm going to send them. I'm sure Farooq can put out of my unbrushed teeth, so I can happily admit to that. It doesn't look that bad on a scan. You sort of look, oh yeah, I can see a little bit there. It's not like oodles of plaque that you would potentially notice. But when you do this sort of metrology, when you're lining up the models 10 minutes apart, you're kind of putting color maps over them and going, yeah, that's not good. And there's lots of data basically saying that initial aligner fit, you need to make sure they fit as well as possible for the entire treatment. But this is more than aligners. We're getting brackets now with custom bases. You're getting a custom-made 3D digital bracket made, and it's fitting over the top of the plaque. And yes, you can fill that in with composite resin, and you do when you're bonding brackets. But it's not going to be as strong. You want the bracket to engage to the tooth. You need the mesh to be as close as possible. We know this from braces. The same thing happens with the 3D bonding attachments. If there is a 0.1 mil gap, the bond strength drops off. It's just, these things are relatively comparable. So I think fundamentally, when we're doing records, we need to clean the teeth, and that helps us grab the tooth itself. We're not factoring in other variables that are unchangeable and stuff that we actually want to take off. And I mean, I'm a clinician, so purely from a patient management perspective, it's great. Like mum and dad come in, we just go, we're going to make sure the teeth are clean. We want him to have clean teeth because I want my patients to have nice, clean teeth. And it means that we do oral hygiene before I've even started anything. And if they're not wanting to clean their teeth before we've started, you're probably not a good aligner candidate. You're probably not a good braces candidate. So it means you can set the oral hygiene tone right from the beginning and carry it forward. So it has good practice management sides of things as a practicing clinician, and it has good mechanical sides of things. And it's something that I never thought of. Like, I would hope I could brush my teeth well, and 24 hours getting that amount of plaque. How many of our patients don't brush that well? How many of our patients do we only send them off if we can visibly see it?
Yeah. I think that, our conversations dwell in the biomechanics, the materials that we're using, but actually something which will be perceived as being simplistic actually doesn't get much conversation. So it's really interesting that of all those variables that you've gone and explored, actually plaque was one of the biggest ones. I think that's so interesting. You've already mentioned it in terms of the location errors causing a change in the vectors. And I remember when you described this thinking, wowza, that's really bad, right? We're going to change from extrusion to intrusion. But you've also spoken about all the other variables that contribute to that process. And my question to you is, are we doomed to work with errors within attachments? We may be able to minimize some of them. So you mentioned it in your JCO paper, which is coming through, about removing the plaque first. You've already described that. Training your staff, being balanced in your pressure in terms of its insertion, avoiding segmenting trays, avoiding lingual attachments. We'll get into that shortly. But my question to you is that ultimately, are we accepting errors in this process?
Yeah. Look, in all of orthodontics and actually all of healthcare, it is error control. You know, we treat on a standard patient. We assume that the roots are of a certain length, the things, but as soon as you start pushing everything, as soon as you start doing anything, it's going to change. And so what we're doing is we are working with a dynamic system based on kind of unknowns. The thing is, there are errors that we can't control, and I think there will always be there. But there are lots of errors that we can control, and we as a profession haven't been looking at it, you know, and some of it can be if there's no better way of doing it, or no one's bothered to come up with a list of the potential problems, then everyone just assumes it's fine. You need the kind of random Australian to come along and go, you know, the emperor's got no clothes. We're sticking these attachments on quite badly. And like I started this sort of scanning, so sort of bonding my attachments, rescanning it, thinking I stick attachments on really, really well. This will be good. I'll show that like these are all fine. And I was quite horrified with what I was doing. And then over many iterations, I just go, okay, now I've got to try this little thing, and where is that coming from? And I read as much as I could to find out what other people had covered. And you were talking about the location errors, and yeah, I mentioned there was that Chen thesis, and it kind of, probably got something here. It kind of makes sense. So what I got to type it on. I can kind of show people. So if we've got like a tray here and everything's fitting nicely, it works really well. You know, you can see the whole thing. If we've sectioned the tray, you can have it sitting, and it's sort of just from first principles. Yes, he's got the data, but you can have it sitting out on one side. On the other side, it looks like it's sitting in. So I'll sit it out on one side. Other side looks like it's sitting in. But obviously that's going to rock the tray, push the attachments more gingival. Now, if you're trying to do the opposite movement, it means that the attachment is going to engage. Then the tooth is not going to engage. And when we had a chance to look at some really big data, there were certain movements that you actually did better without attachments than with attachments. And we're kind of looking into this, but the hypothesis is a poorly placed attachment actually results in worse movement and worse kind of expression of that movement than the tooth itself. Like, you want to grab onto the tooth as much as possible, which sort of leads back to cleaning the teeth and getting that plaque off. You want to grab the tooth. You want the attachment to grab the tooth, and you want it to be as accurate as possible, because every little thing that you can control is one variable that you can't, because there is enough uncontrollable variables. And you were mentioning before, like, it's like slop in brackets. We cannot control that. With new digital bonding and custom printed brackets, we're trying to control that more and more. This is the aligner equivalent. We're trying to get better and better error control in an uncontrollable situation.
Great. So in terms of then looking at, let's explore slop. Let's explore that play that we understand from fixed appliances through to arch wires, and we know it relates to the brackets being slightly oversized, the arch wires being slightly undersized. In terms of translating that to aligners, you've described the attachments. Okay, let's just say, for argument's sake, that is your bracket positioning. But actually, the interaction between the plastic and the tooth, arch wire, the bracket slot, varies. And we know that from Nicholas Koenig's study from 2022, which I thought was a landmark study, comparing different materials, and essentially showing that gap is there, but also that gap between the tooth and the aligner varies. They showed it was smaller for direct to printed, but it was still there. Now, my question to you is, so we've spoken about the attachments and its accuracy and its relevance, but actually, are we fundamentally working within a system like fixed appliances where there's always going to be that play in between the aligner and the tooth surface? And therefore, it's always going to be working with this degree of error within the process. How good can we actually get at this?
So I think we need to get as good as possible. They're like, even prior to that sort of paper, there was things on the fit of like Zendura retainers with a pressure forming machine versus a vacuum forming machine. And you could see the accuracy and fit with that increased pressure and that increased sort of compliance onto that 3D model. But there will be this change, and there kind of needs to be. You need a spot where you're applying the pressure for the tooth and applying the tooth to move into it. So you need that little bit of give. You need the play in the system to allow that kind of biological movement. It's something that I think it is a factor. I think we need to try to get it as small as possible. But I think that is one of those factors that we cannot control, and we can plan around it. And I think we can try to understand it, but it is an uncontrollable factor. And the other one is direct print aligners give us the option of varying the thickness. We can have different thicknesses of aligner trays with pressure form ones. You can actually put them down and vaguely how thick they are in any given spot, but we know that they lose maybe 60-70% of their size. You start with one and you end up with about a 0.6, 0.64. They do shrink down, and that is another fact that we need to be able to control for, need to at least be able to think about in our mechanics. So looking at the final aligner size, what you actually deliver to the patient, versus looking at the initial blank size is an important factor.
Great. I'm going to move on to attachment design. And in your paper, you describe 4 types of attachments throughout there in terms of their design. So we've got ellipsoid, rectangular, beveled, and pyramidal. And you've mentioned that you don't like optimized attachments. Is that correct?
Yeah. So from a practical clinical perspective, I don't like optimized attachments. Clinically, they don't express where they should. They don't kind of provide the goals they should. And I think a lot of it comes down to, and was what I was saying at EAS, was we need a Swiss Army knife. We are moving teeth in many, many directions. I'm not kind of pushing just extruding a tooth or just rotating a tooth. I'm often, it's a corkscrew. You're doing both. So I need an attachment that can do both. What I like about the optimized attachments is they are beautifully engineered. They're engineered on a really cool force gauge, and it's at a static point, and they can kind of build along, but it's designed step by step to provide this active face with pressure points and move those teeth. The thing is, you are relying purely on that optimized attachment, and if anything, that optimized attachment then needs to be even more accurate than anything else that you can put in. You put a conventional attachment, it's bigger, it's covering more area. Part of it might be accurate, part of it might not be. It gives you that kind of thing. You can push it in one direction, then suddenly go, actually, no, I went too far. My overcorrection overdid. I can push it in the opposite direction. It's not this sort of single surface that is like purely reliant on it. Then on top of that, we look at the wear and the fact that from 4 months onwards, optimized attachments had increased wear and tear on them compared to conventional attachments. And they are so reliant on that single active surface. It's why when they looked at it, they found that, while orthodontists generally preferred conventional attachments, I think a lot of us have had cases where we've looked at it and thought, yeah, this is cool. I will give it a go. These optimized ones, they sound really good. I want my patients' movement to be optimized. This sounds great. You put them on and you're looking at a premolar, you want to expand and you want to rotate and bring it down, and you get the extrusion attachment on it, and it does one of those movements quite well, and then you start to do the other one and it doesn't track. We were chatting before about the research paper on rotation, and wasn't statistically significant, but they kind of looked at rotation of premolars, and they found that rotation of premolars alone had about 49% with optimized versus 42% without. And while not statistically significant, let's just put that aside and assume that it is. I kind of think it supports the argument. If you can look at a single movement, you can just isolate it down to that one movement, and that is all you need to do. You want to go for, I think optimized is quite good. I just know that I move teeth in multiple directions. I've never found a tooth that I just want to rotate. I want to rotate. I want to torque it a little bit. I want to maybe extrude it a bit. it's just one of those things that you need an attachment that can do it. So, like when I was using a lot of aligners, Invisalign, I tended to go away from them now. I would basically look at it because they've given you the blueprint of where the most difficult movement is. That active face, I'd get all of those on there and I'd look at it and go, yippee, that's the direction I want my conventional attachment to be. They've done the engineering in the background. I take the optimized attachment off, I replace it with a conventional attachment with that same direction of active face of my conventional attachment, and things went along better. So that was sort of my first foray into looking at attachments and thinking about them, because I thought this has been engineered by a lot of really smart people, but they're engineers, they're not clinicians. They're like, this is designed for this, but in a clinical situation, we're not robots on a bench. We've got saliva, we've got poor compliance, we've got abrasion on the attachments. We're not remaking each one and assuming that it's going to be perfect. And the classic one was the Grudy paper that's just come out looking at extrusion. So they looked at extrusion with sort of 3 types of conventional attachments versus 1 type of optimized extrusion attachment, and they found significantly more improvement in the conventional. But it was interesting that they had the 3 types of conventional and it actually made no difference between them. So they actually grouped that all together as one group, and they purely just compared all types of conventional, whether it's incisively beveled, gingerly beveled, or bar, with just that other kind of optimized attachment, and it was quite significant. We're looking at about 70, I think it's 79% off memory versus 62. Extrusion is one of the hardest movements we've got. I want to get everything I can out of it. That kind of bordering on 80% accuracy is much better than sort of that bordering on, I'm rounding the numbers, 60% accuracy. It's the classic. From my mentor Tony Weir, who's really pushed me in this direction, is he loves getting up on stage and going, okay, I've got a revolver, and put it to my head. Which one would you prefer? Do you want a 60% or 30% chance of blowing your head off, or 40? You want to go for the best possible thing to get the best outcome for your patient, because that's what matters.
I definitely want to come to an Australian meeting if that's what's happening on stage. That sounds most pressing. That's really great. Thank you. That's unveiled what's happening. And if I can try and translate from my mind, as you described it, is that actually, although the engineering behind it is accurate, actually in terms of delivering it to a real tooth, actually you do need to account for potentially some of those factors you described in terms of the errors, and actually allowing the force vector to change during the treatment depending on what movement's taking place, because the tooth isn't moving in a linear direction. It's going to have multiple movements staged in. Really insightful. Thank you very much for that.
And we know teeth don't track. So the optimized attachments assume it's tracking the whole way, all the way through. It's optimized for that tracking. We know that aligners underexpress. So as soon as you get past that first stage, you're kind of lost.
Great. Trim lines. So you spoke about trim lines, also the EAS. You mentioned how straight trim lines offer better force distribution. Greater tooth movements take place. Tang's paper from last year. And my question to you is, should trim lines be default for aligners?
I think for most cases, straight trim lines should be the default. I can think of a couple of exceptions to that, and I got some toys to be able to show you. And we're trying to work on a research paper to try and draw this out and kind of figure where straight trim lines wouldn't be a good idea. But the thing is, for most cases, you want to have that straight trim line because you're reducing the height of your aligner. It's like going for a 12 night eye versus an 18 night eye. We know that a thicker wire is going to express certain movements better. On top of that, if you've got the scalloping, tying together some of the research from Marie and Paolo on their attachments and the position of those, and that was a physical model study where they looked at physical models and the force levels for rotation. And tying that together with some of the other straight line research where they showed the pressure points using photosensitive paper on there, they found that essentially more incisal attachments had better grip, better adhesion. And pretty much almost everything below the scalloping line was the aligner was floppy. It just flipped out. And we kind of go, well, why is torque control? Why is torque control hard with aligners? And I think the scalloping is at least one of the factors. But a lot of this goes into other things. If we've got straight cuts, we've got the opportunity for other options. We can put ball clasps, the aligner equivalent of ball clasps, interproximally between the sixes. So for me and my defaults, if I've got a patient who comes in, they've got an implant, I don't want to put an attachment on that implant crown, but implants almost always have undercuts built into them. So like your aligner companies often put digital block out there, especially if you're doing sort of straight ones. So I can go, I want 0 digital block out on any tooth that is a crown, any tooth that is an implant. And if I don't want to put an attachment on, I get 0 block out on. It actually engages into that tooth almost like a ball clasp. And if I need more, I just manually put it in. Because I love attachments. I think they are 100% necessary. But it takes time putting them on, takes time taking it off. You got the issues of plastics and everything kind of, leaching off. We know that they're abrading away and we know where that's going. So the less attachments I can do, the better it is for me clinically and the better it is for the patient. And I think the straight cuts that basically offer that with essentially, you kind of look at, a straight cut versus a scalloped. One of them is essentially just going to flex more because it loses that kind of rigidity. I did say the one area where I probably may not want straight cuts, and it's something it shows up in both the aligner systems, but I've changed the way I often do aligners. I really don't want to expand with aligners almost ever. And I don't want to expand for a couple of reasons, but one of them comes down to this. Like if you've got there's data and from Gomez, and I actually met him when I went to the AAO. It was great chatting with him, showing the straight cuts offer better expansion. But I still don't like expanding because you kind of look at the aligner, and when you have an underexpressed expansion, you can see that it actually provides an additional buccal root torque to the upper incisors. Like your patients are squeezing that in to it wants to be there. Your patients are squeezing that in to get into their relatively narrow arch. The effect on the back is potentially, we're trying to work out we've got some things on it, but it looks like it's putting force, like buccal root torque, on the upper anteriors. So by trying to do one movement at the back, we're actually creating these counter forces at the front. And this is why I like researching aligners, because for braces, we kind of know these adverse effects. We think, okay, if we do this, we're going to get this. If we do this, we're going to get this. Aligners are a relatively new game. We haven't put these sort of multiple movements together. When you kind of look at the scallop ones, they do it as well, but not as much. So I think for either avoiding expansion, or expanding with other appliances, which is my preference these days, or actually deliberately high scalloping on the inside if you know you're going to do a bit of expansion. It might underexpress the expansion, or maybe you get to a certain point, I'm going to refine because I don't want to increase the torque, or just understanding that it is going to do that. So you have to have counteracting forces to counter that adverse effect of the aligner.
I think that's so interesting. I think that's almost the seed of what pre-adjusted appliances were. The ability to have a prescription which would express itself and actually generally give you the movements that you wanted. Looks as though we're still in that thought process in terms of aligners, that if you move in this direction, that's going to take place. Okay, we need to now counter for that and start thinking about making that default. How very interesting. My question to you is, some aligner companies do not offer trimline variations. Considering what you've just described as it should be the default, pending on certain movements, why is it that we don't have this commercially available? Considering the evidence is there, the biomechanics is there, what's withholding us?
Look, I think it comes down to a couple of things. The computer programming to have straight cut is actually a lot harder. The gingiva is a lot more variable. You're making a series of aligners where you have to predict where the gingiva is going to go. It's actually from a pure technique perspective and sort of materials process, it is easier to do scallops because you're only focusing on the hard bits that you can see. Once you start to involve the gums, you need to really think about it. And either you just make a few at a time and you can kind of remake and rescan and remake and rescan. But takes a lot of clinic time. To actually get it all together and go for that straight cut, it is a lot more technique sensitive for the aligner companies to actually make it. It seems like it would be easier. You just cut them off straight, but you to what point? Like how high? You don't want to create pressure points on the gingiva. Like you need that to be carefully modeled and carefully looked at. And I think that is why they're not all doing this. It's actually in a funny way. While it might be harder for us to physically cut in the labs, the scalloping for us, they've got robots that do it for them. For an aligner company, it's harder to get that back end software to predict where the gums are going.
That's really interesting. Now, you mentioned the ball clasp. I'm interested. So the idea of having no undercuts allows greater engagement, but the idea of having negative attachment, so the so-called power ridges, came as a concept and occupied that space. But actually, the research showed they didn't seem to make much of a difference when it came to torque expression. Patients found them uncomfortable. Clinicians seemed to, for their different reasons or patient factors, really didn't think that they were working as well. So although the idea of having it is there, where do you stand on items like negative attachments such as power ridges?
Look, I think most of the data is on scalloped aligners. And I think in scalloped aligners, those negative things have been thoroughly disproven. The data doesn't exist for straight cut. So I'm not, I don't ask for like a negative space, because then you can kind of get the watermelon seed effect. You're overly squeezing, it can pop out the other way. But clinically, I can go, look, I want it to get back to zero. Like, obviously not in a periodontal patient. You got a perio patient, you want some digital blockout. You don't want it like touching on the inside, you want a little bit of digital blockout, but you want to engage as much of the tooth as possible. Like your tooth is the best attachment. It doesn't change. Plaque does, but the tooth doesn't. Everything you put on, I think, will have some level of inaccuracy, and it's our job to get that as low as possible. But if we can engage more of the tooth itself, I'm not using those things to actually grab onto the teeth in terms of pushing, but I'm using it to grab onto, like if I want to extrude a tooth, I've got an undercut. It's going to apply the force on that undercut, and I don't want to have this great bit that I'm using and then block it out and then add an attachment. It seems counterproductive. I would prefer to go, let's just use what we've got. And with straight cut aligners, I mean, this is going back to the Crawley paper in 2012, where they looked at the force application with and without attachments in scalloped and straight, and they found that you could actually often get better force application in a straight cut aligner without attachments than a scalloped aligner with attachments. It's why as soon as there was a straight cut aligner on the market, I changed most of my clinic over to it.
It's really insightful, really insightful. So it's not actually the premise of the negative attachment or the power ridge. It's actually about how that force gets delivered, and the trim line will, of course, impact upon that. Interesting, and I hope it's something that you'll work on and share with us. Attachment accuracy. Okay, so you've been working with Solvenum in terms of their 3D printed grip attachments, and this seems to almost have been a kind of follow on from your research and describing, well, these are all the errors that take place in terms of the attachment side of it. And then there's this product that comes out. So could you explain what solutions this 3D printed grip attachments offer you and what you've seen from it?
So because mum's dentist, dad's an orthodontist, all this sort of stuff, I've got and Tony Weir being my mentor, I've got a long history of being skeptical. And there's a lot of cool things that come on the market. They just seem wonderful. Like, it's like, yep, this is the newest, latest, greatest thing. If you're not using it for your patient, like, why aren't you doing it? So they came out with this thing, and I looked at it and thought, this is dangerous because I want to really like this. And that's where I get worried. Like, if I want to really like something, I'm like, this is solving a lot of the problems that I could see. I want to like it. So I was like, radio, I gotta take a step back from it, and I gotta go basic orthodontic kind of things. I've got to think, okay, how do I take them off? Like, my first thing when I'm putting an appliance in, before I put it in, I want to know it comes off smoothly. So I got one of them, I bonded it to my tooth, I left it there for a day or two, and then flicked it off, all fine. Okay, good. Okay, as long as we're safe, I can take them off because I worry about these things. Now it's achieved that bar. Let's actually start to play around with it with some patients. And I basically just kept going with that research. I looked at those patients and I kind of scanned before and after, and again, applying those same learnings that I took from my conventional attachments or my resin attachments, I then started applying those to these 3D grip attachments, and my attachments got more accurate. I had even more surfaces within that kind of tight tolerance. I then kind of went and go, well, this looks good in like a few patients. I don't have a sample size. Let's actually just approach them and say, can you send me somewhere around 30 to 40? Because I had enough of a sample to kind of figure what sample size calculation. I need about 30 attachments, 30 arches. And I 3D printed a stack of base models, and then I stuck the exact same case. And it was actually my first case I did, the very first case I did, where I scanned immediately after bonding, and I was horrified at how badly I bonded those attachments. And I reproduced that, and I basically go, okay, let's see how this is going. Let's get these stacker models, and it was more significant. It had less overfill, so less that positive volumetric error. It had less underfill, and this is in terms of averages. The average positive and average negative. You've got to divide those. If you do an average of a positive and negative over an entire attachment, it averages to zero because plus them. So you separate those. It also had, in terms of the surface areas within kind of a tolerance, I set 0.1 mil as a tolerance because I thought, okay, we've got a bit of plaque. There are other factors in here. I ran a different tolerance bar at 0.25, but I think by this point, my bonding technique had got to a point that I wasn't having anything really at that range, so it sort of was a bit in like that came up with nothing. So I go, okay, 0.1. It was more significant. More surfaces were in that 0.1 mil with the 3D printed on these 3D models, and it was approaching that of the models that I fully 3D printed. So I took the ideal STL, fully 3D printed, and scanned it just to check, because printers have errors, scanners have errors. So I kind of had that as my error control, and it really kind of opened my mind and changed. Like, okay, good. This isn't like something that I'm, have to be too fearful of. I can bond them quite well. It is quite technique sensitive, and a lot of the things is honestly cleaning the teeth before I start made a massive difference. But good isolation, good retraction. The lower left 7 is the most difficult for me as a right-handed operator, and I actually got it down to it's the hardest for my dental assistants. Like it's hardest for them with their suction. Therefore, it's actually the one that's most likely to pop off. And I now change where I'm bonding. Like I will bond from, and irrespective of the template, I will bond from the most difficult attachment to the easiest attachment. So I know that lower 7s, moisture. Like 6s and 7s, I got moisture control. Then my next most difficult is sort of my lingual attachments on the inside, because there's a lot more variability. I can't really see them. Like I can get them okay, but like they're the next most kind of problematic ones. Then I'm going for any instanding teeth. Like if you've got a blocked out lateral, you really need an attachment on it. And it's actually one of the most difficult to get an accurate attachment, because by the nature of putting like the attachment template over, you'll actually stretch the template out. If you start curing the canine, the light will seep and actually start pre-curing the lateral that's on the inside, and you'll be curing in an overfilled position. So I actually changed the order. I announced to my staff, we're going to go 7s, we're going to go the lateral, we're going to go, and we actually go around curing from most difficult to least difficult, which is something I adopted from braces. I direct bond my braces. I like to do the most difficult at the beginning when I'm fresh and at the start of a band up, and kind of go to the easier ones at the end when I'm a bit, you're going, okay, good. Okay, I got this sorted at the end where I'm a bit more tired. You're focused for too long.
Yeah. Linton, you mentioned the lingual attachments. So if there is a greater error within placing lingual attachments, should we be using them? Should we just stick to labial? What's your thoughts on on the inaccuracy of lingual versus the biomechanical advantage lingual may offer you?
So the biomechanical advantage is there's about three really good finite element model studies, essentially showing that lingual attachments offer better force delivery than buccal attachments, and like purely from a mechanical point of view, if you've got like a class 1 deep bite, you put lingual attachments on the inside, they're like bite turbos. You put labial attachments on the outside of the lower incisors. You then create your occlusal bite blocks with or without the aligners in, and that bite opens up really, really quickly. So, like, there is good mechanics for it, and there's good rationale, there's good finite element models. But then when I was actually scanning them and I was looking at the inaccuracy, most of my really big issues, most of my flash, most of my bowing, most of my separation, most of my other things is on the inside. And I think it partly was, there's more plaque and stuff, especially like the lower anteriors, but even the upper, there's a lot more variability. Genetically, we've got much more a uniform surface on the outside of our teeth, where we've been smiling at people for generations, and the outside is a lot more. We can get standard brackets. You start going lingual brackets, you got to get custom bases. Like you can't buy an off the shelf lingual bracket, or you can, but then you have to put a base on and then stick it on. That's why lingual has more variability. And like president of the Lingual Society, I like putting things on the inside. It makes mechanical sense to me. Patients like it because they can't see it, and I want to look at it. I don't have a good lingual bonding solution. Like, we can't bond these 3D printed ones on the inside yet. And I want to use that biomechanical improvement because it is there versus the inaccuracies. I will get more flash on the lingual, which means that the tooth will push more buccally, and that is a force vector that I don't want. Now, in maybe a class 3 case, it's useful, but I don't necessarily want them on the inside in a class 3 case, and it is a research question that we really need to delve into, and it's kind of hard to do in patients looking at these single movements, but it is something we're trying to put up onto some robots and some machines just to see what's better, more accurate on the outside, which I can now get with my 3D printed, versus less accurate on the inside, with the superior kind of biomechanical force application.
What a, I think that's an interesting solution. 3D printed on the inside to increase the accuracy there. At the EAS, Keejoon Lee presented his solution to attachments, which was the so-called universal attachment. The idea is that you essentially place the attachments first, you then scan, you get your aligners produced, eliminating by default any errors in location, which you mentioned is a key premise there. What do you think about that as a premise? Yes, it's 2 stages rather than 1 stage, but actually you've eliminated one of the significant errors, especially for the lingual ones. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a good idea. It works quite well. It's got good scientific ideas and theories behind it. The most accurate attachment is the one you can scan. I mean, we've still got scanner inaccuracies. We still have potentially, you've got to make sure the teeth are clean. That plaque, don't like let them go and have a whole lot of food before, after you've bonded, before you've put them on. You still have issues with the aligner fit, but it gives you that immediate kind of attachment there. The problem with it then is you lose the force direction. So, we've got these brilliant kind of things which have been, the force is, you're just guessing. You're putting them on before you know. So, like, my approach to it is I often now I limit the number of aligners I order. I might plan the full case, get 40 aligners, but I'll go, let's just get 5 or 10 delivered. We can give those to the patient. I can do a refinement early on and actually have those attachments as accurate as possible for the rest. So it gives me an accurate attachment for the first 5 or 10. We kind of know those first aligner movements are just sort of pushing the teeth out, making space. We need the teeth to slide past each other. You need the gaps between the teeth for that biomechanically. And that means you refine early, and hopefully that early refinement can carry you through to the end. You kind of get the benefits of being able to plan it, the direction of those attachments. You get all those sort of, the orientation, so you can push it where you want, with the advantage that you've got an attachment that is on immediately. It brings it to one stage, and you can kind of carry on with what you want.
So it's a nice idea, but actually, if you don't know the resultant direction or the different direction of tooth movement, then yeah, as you say, you're guessing. I like your idea. Put the attachments on from the planned perspective, but go to refinement early. You know you've then eliminated even the unknown location error you've created. That's great. Look, Linton, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It really has. And I'm glad we managed to connect, even though you're in a different time zone, almost in a different world. One thing I like to end the podcast with is one piece of advice for the orthodontists out there. Linton, can you share that with us?
Sorry, Dad's just here. Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I've got is give it a go. I kind of talked about this, but I was at the Australian Society of Lingual Orthodontists, and there was a lecturer that basically didn't show up. They didn't come along. They couldn't dial in Zoom at the right time, and I essentially went along and I said, okay, we've got to basically have a look at this, and we've got to make sure that we can have a presentation. And I put my hand up. I said, yep, let's really have a look at this and kind of get this, get something up. And I stood up and I gave an impromptu lecture on auto transplantation. And that led me to actually realizing that I like lecturing and I actually enjoy doing all this sort of stuff. And I kind of, love getting up and talking. Mum and Dad have just come in. We're at the Australian Society of Orthodontists. I'm about to go off to their dental ball. Mum and Dad are here. I might as well get them to come and say hello. Come on, get it. Give me a funny face. They're here. I'm just commandeering their hotel room to do this. Yeah, we had a great view. But this is my boss. And that's the boss. Yeah, and yeah, so we're kind of give it a go. Like I have them around supporting me, which is great, and telling me this sort of intergenerational advice. Sometimes you just got to go, let's just do the mad thing. I'm going to stand up in a polo shirt in front of 300-400 orthodontists and give an impromptu lecture on auto transplantation. It's and that's led me to where I am now, coming over to the EAS lecturing. If you want to do something, just do it. Seize those opportunities.
Fantastic. Linton, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I thought this podcast would just be a rehash of our previous conversation, but I've learned so much from you in this particular conversation, your thought processes, the direction of travel, why you've got to where you are, and also where you think we should get to. And I'm really excited to look at your research as it comes through to help answer some of those questions you've posed today. Thank you so much. Enjoy your society's meeting. Love to Peter and to Lynette. Hope you have a great time.
Yes, thank you so much.
Take care.